Okay friends, one of the first things you want to do to get started on this job is to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, we're going to have a look at the caliper. That's this area right here. Located in this area is the caliper piston. When you step on the brake, the piston's going to go out and squeeze the pads up against the rotor. What we need to do is push that piston in. So I'm just going to use a pry bar, carefully get in between this area. I'm going to pry up against the caliper and try to get in there up against the rotor. Now I'll just gently pry this and you should be able to see that piston making its way in a little bit. Now at this point, if you look inside here, you can see the caliper piston and you can see that brake pad. I can go ahead and move this around. That tells me I should be able to get this caliper off of here. Now we can go ahead and start taking the caliper off the bracket. To do that, I'm going to come right here to these 15mm headed bolts and we can remove the pair. There's one down bottom and one up top. What you're going to notice for these is these pins actually go all the way into this area right here. So if it feels like it's very hard to turn, more than likely it's due to the fact that the pin is stuck in this area. Okay. That one's nice and loose. I'm going to leave this in here so the caliper can't move around on me while I continue on to the other one. Before we take out those pins, let's grab a bungee cord or even a caliper hook that looks like this. I'm going to put this right up onto the strut spring. And now when we take off the caliper, we can hang this on that hook without putting any pressure on our flex hose. With that said, we can start pulling out our pins. There's our top one. Let's have a look at the very end where my index finger is right here. This one has a rubber bushing on it. That's for vibration dampening. Keep that in mind. Let's grab this one down here. Looking at the very end, there's no vibration dampener. So once again, the top slider has the vibration dampener. The lower slider does not. Remember that for installation. Go ahead and carefully remove that caliper and quickly give it an inspection in this area right here. If you see any fluid, it's more than likely brake fluid, and if that's the case, you have to replace the caliper. Now let's go ahead and hang this, putting no pressure on that flex hose so we don't damage it in any way. Next, we can start removing our brake pads from the area. Now typically for this, you can just reach in, grab them, and they should slide right out. You're going to want to give them a quick inspection. Obviously, if they look like this one right here, well, it's time to be replaced. Pop this out of here. Oh yeah. Those are good. Now moving along the back side of the knuckle, you're going to be able to find the two 15mm headed bolts to hold the caliper bracket to the knuckle. We're going to go ahead and remove the pair of those bolts. Just like before, once we get the first bolt loose, we're going to go ahead and leave it in just a couple threads. That way there we can fully remove the other one without the caliper bracket moving around too much on us. Inspect those bolts as you remove them. Of course, we'll set them aside. We can clean those up later. Remove your caliper bracket, set it aside as well. Now we can go ahead and get the rotor off of here. If it's stuck on the hub, generally I like to hit along these areas right here, but being very careful not to hit up against any of the studs because you don't want to damage the threads. Let's get that right off of there, inspect it, set it aside. Now with the rotor off of there, the next thing that I always do is spray down the entire backing area with some penetrant, especially along where the bolt threads are. We'll let this sit while we continue. While that's soaking, let's continue on to our ABS wire. We're going to have to start disconnecting this. There's going to be a tab that I can grab right here, but what we actually want to do is come right to this area with some long nose pliers, and I'm going to squeeze on these two tabs right here, and that's going to make it so we can remove the ABS wire from its mounting zone here. And now you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to grab onto this tab with my thumb, carefully pull it up, and disconnect it. Now that I have it disconnected, we're going to give this a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This one looks fine, so I'm going to set it aside. Let's continue on to using a 34mm to remove our axle nut. Now, if you're using a ratchet to try to remove this, you might notice that this wants to spin on you. If that's the case, go ahead and put a pry bar in between your studs along here and then down to the ground. That'll prevent it from spinning, so you can use your 34mm to remove that nut. A little bit of penetrant. Now let's use a hammer and punch. We're going to come right into the center area of the axle right here and give it a couple loving bonks to break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Once you're sure it's broken free, we can continue. Now to get this wheel bearing off of here, what we want to do is start removing our 13mm headed bolts that you're going to see along the back side of the knuckle. You're going to have 3 of these, one on the bottom corner towards the front, one on the bottom corner towards the rear, and then also up top. Let's go ahead and remove all 3. If you find you have a hard time getting your socket in here, typically you can go ahead and push that axle in towards the inner portion of the vehicle. That's going to give you a little bit more space right here. The next thing that I always do is just go ahead and take my axle nut and put it on there a couple threads, because we're going to continue with our hammer and we're going to give this a couple loving bonks just to try to break it free from the knuckle. By having the nut on here, it's going to prevent it from falling off and potentially hurting anyone. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and remove this axle nut. We can set it aside. So now that this is broken free, there's going to be a couple things that we want to pay attention to. Obviously, we have our backing plate, which is going to come off with the bearing, and we can separate that after. But you have your ABS wire, which comes through from inside this knuckle all the way to the back right here. So what we're going to do is start grabbing on to this backing plate and the bearing, start pulling it through. You'll see the ABS wire wants to come through as well. If it gets stuck, just go ahead and push that axle in a little further. It should give you some space along the back. Go ahead and remove that shield. And there it is, friends. Now with the bearing out of there, we're going to have to do a little bit of cleanup before we go ahead and install our brand new bearing. Looking inside this area right here, you might find a whole bunch of debris, corrosion, or anything the like. Essentially, we want to make sure we get all of that out of the inside aspect right here. You also want to make sure you clean up the outer portion of the knuckle, where that bearing's going to sit up against with that backing plate, of course. And then generally, I like to go ahead and clean up the axle splines a little bit as well. Once you have this entire area cleaned up, let's go ahead and grab onto that backing plate. You're going to want to clean both mating surfaces, one on each side. After you're done that, go ahead and clean up the threading on all of your mounting bolts for the bearing. Now once you have that done, it's going to be time to start preparing our brand new wheel bearing. What I mean by that is if you were to look at the electrical connector for this, you're going to find that it has a different mounting tab on it than what was originally on the original bearing. So we're going to go ahead and get this tab off of here. Looking at this side, you can see 2 ears that peen over. Let's just go ahead and pick those off of there with a small screwdriver or a pick or whatever you have, and then we can slide the metal right out of the way. Now we can just go ahead and bend this tab a little bit. With both of those tabs peened a little bit, I'm going to grab this with some long pliers. I'm going to give it a little tug upward a little bit to try to separate it and then pull it off. Let's pull that right off of there. Now we can go ahead and put on the mounting tab that we're supposed to use for this. Looking at it, you can see that it has this little nub that comes out. That's going to be facing towards the area with the connector. So all I want to do is just stick it right inside the grooves here, and we'll slide it forward, and then you're going to see it lock in right here. There we are. Give that a little tug. Make sure it's completely secured. The next thing we're going to do is take some copper never sees, and I essentially want to make sure I get some inside this area along here and all along this aspect of this as well. That's going to help prevent any type of corrosion or buildup in there, and it will also help with removal in the future if needed. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and put our bearing on with that backing plate. Now obviously the ABS wire is going to have to go through that backing plate hole. We can get that sort of into position here. And now we're going to have to take that same ABS wire and put it through the hole right here where you can see the axle goes through. So I'm just going to push this aside. We'll slide it right on through. There we are. Now we're going to pay attention to this lip right here, which has the mounting point for that ABS wire. You want to make sure it's up and inside this area, right above that outer tie rod end. Once you have everything in position, go ahead and slide it all together. Let's get this lined up. Now I'm going to take one of my mounting bolts. I always use some red thread locker on all of my mounting bolts whenever it comes to steering, suspension, or even brakes. Once all of your mounting bolts are started, go ahead and snug them up, and then when you torque these afterward, torque them to 70 foot-pounds. Now we can connect in our ABS wire. Listen for a click. Give it a nice tug to make sure it's secure. Now we can take this, we're going to swoop it right down and underneath this area and put it up and through. Make sure that's secure. Red thread locker on that axle stud. Go ahead and start on your axle nut. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is go ahead and bottom out this nut real quick by hand with a ratchet. And then we'll get it closer to the ground, put a nice bar going across, and then we can torque this to 118 foot-pounds. Copper never sees on your mating surface. Now I'm going to be replacing my brakes, but if you weren't, you would of course want to be having a look at the backside right here, which is the mating surface that's going to go up against your bearing. Go ahead and sand that down so it's clean and free of any of this debris. Now we can get our rotor on here. Once you have it on, typically I just use one of my original lug nuts. We'll just go ahead and bottom this out on here to prevent the rotor from moving around on us while we continue. I went ahead and cleaned up the caliper slider pins. I'm going to go ahead and set these aside before I lubricate them. We'll do that in a minute. The next thing we're going to talk about is the caliper itself. Looking at ours, you can see that we have a lot of rust buildup on this. It's very important to make sure you get the majority, if not all of that off of there so it doesn't fall into the brakes. Next, it's going to be time to put our caliper bracket on. Make sure you clean and re-thread lock the bolts. Start both of these bolts in, we'll snug them up, and then we're going to torque these to 137 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to insert our brake pads. Now looking at the inner pad, you're going to be looking for this tab right here. That's the wear indicator. Let's take that pad, we'll put it in position. Just pretty much slide it right into that bracket. Now essentially you want to make sure that this can move around once it's in there. If you had to use a hammer to bonk it in there, more than likely the bracket isn't cleaned up enough. Let's do the same to that outer pad. Make sure it can move around. Now let's take some more of that high temperature caliper grease and we're going to go right along the metallic piston of the caliper here. Just a thin coating. And then continue with that grease and go along the back side of each of these ears. All of this grease is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can go ahead and slide our caliper over the brake pads. Now as I do this, the areas that you want to pay attention to are the slider boots right here. You have one along the bottom and the top, of course. We're just going to go ahead and press that in, and we'll slide the caliper into place. Let's apply some of that caliper lubricant to each of these slider pins. We're going to go ahead and coat the entire shaft of both. And when we coat it, we also want to make our way up and into the groove closest to where that threaded area is. That's where the boot's going to be, like I told you before. By putting grease into that area, it's going to make sure that no moisture or debris make its way into the caliper slider port. Now once you have them well lubricated, we're going to go ahead and start putting in our pins. The one without the bushing goes along the bottom. Start that in. Top bolt with the rubber bushing. Start that in as well. All right, so now we're just going to bottom out both of these mounting bolts, and then we're going to torque each of these to 63 foot-pounds. All right, so let's just double check everything we did, make sure that the brake flex hose isn't twisted and everything's nice and torqued. After that, let's go ahead and remove this lug nut and then grab our wheel. All right, so now you just want to double check everything, make sure everything's tightened and torqued and situated perfectly. After that, let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here. Now we can start on all of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we're going to torque all of the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. All right, the wheel's back on the ground. Let's torque these to that 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got our wheel bearing in there. What's left to do now? Now you're going to want to go ahead and pump up the brake, get under the hood, double check that master cylinder, make sure it's topped off with .3 brake fluid. Now after you've done all that, go ahead and take it for a road test, make sure you don't have any ABS light, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.